Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us here tonight. We're going to be talking about Dear Evan Hansen, a Broadway musical about one teenager and his struggle with isolation in an era in which we're more connected than ever, but many people feel more disconnected than ever. Before we get to the discussion, it's my pleasure to welcome Josh Strobl, an award-winning actor, singer, and dancer who has performed with the Dear Evan Hansen cast, both on Broadway and in Toronto. He's going to be performing 2 songs from the musical for us tonight. The first of those is Waving Through the Window, which in the musical is how we're introduced to Evan and his loneliness and isolation. Waving Through the Window has been covered by Katy Perry, Pentatonics, and has become an anthem for those struggling to connect in a hyper-connected world. Please join me in welcoming Josh.
I've learned to slam on the brake before I even turn the key, before I make the mistake, before I lead with the worst of me. Give them no reason to stare, no slipping up if you slip away. Step out of the sun if you keep getting burned. Step out of the sun because you've learned. On the outside, always looking in, will I ever be more than I've always been? 'Cause I'm tapping on the glass. I'm waving through a window. I try to speak, but nobody can hear, so I wait around for an answer to appear while I'm watching people pass. I'm waving through a window. Can anybody see? Is anybody waving back at me? We start with stars in our eyes. We start believing that we belong, but every sun doesn't rise, and no one tells you where you went wrong. Step out of the sun if you keep getting burned. Step out of the sun because you've learned. On the outside, always looking in, will I ever be more than I've always been? 'Cause I'm tapping on the glass. Waving through a window. I try to speak, but nobody can hear, so I wait around for an answer to appear while I'm watching people pass. Waving through a window. Can anybody see? Is anybody waving? When you're falling in a forest and there's nobody around, do you ever really crash or even make a sound? When you're falling in a forest and there's nobody around, do you ever really crash or even make a sound? When you're falling in a forest and there's nobody around, do you ever really crash or even make a sound? When you're falling in a forest and there's nobody around, do you ever really crash or even make a sound? Did I even make a sound? It's like I never made a sound. Will I ever make a sound? On the outside, always looking in, will I ever be more than I've always been? 'Cause I'm tapping on the glass. Waving through a window. I try to speak, but nobody can hear, so I wait around for an answer to appear while I'm watching people pass. Waving through a window. Can anybody see? Is anybody waving back at me? Is anybody waving? Whoa.
Hell of a singer, right? Well, now it's time for the panel portion of the evening. I'm pleased to introduce our two panelists for the evening. First, Steven Levenson is a Tony Award-winning playwright and television writer, and he's also the author of the Dear Evan Hansen book, and the creator of the character. And secondly, Harold Koplewicz is the founding president of the nonprofit Child Mind Institute in New York City, which is one of Dear Evan Hansen's mental health partners. And he's also a leading child and adolescent psychiatrist. So please welcome them to the stage. Thank you.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you guys for joining us this evening.
You.
The frisk portion comes before the panel portion. Well, thank you both for being here this evening.
Thank you.
It's going to be fun.
Yes. Well, to get us started, for anybody here who has not seen the musical, and if you haven't, you should, if you can, in the near future. Could you tell us a little bit about how you developed the character of Evan?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for being here. I started working on this musical in 2011 with Benj Pasek and Justin Paul, the songwriters. And we started basically with sort of an inkling of an idea. We knew that we wanted to write something about grief and the way that young people, we wanted to tell a story about young people responding to a tragedy. And we had a lot of very abstract ideas about doing a story about social media and connection, and basically all of that eventually filtered into becoming the story of a young man in a world of hyper-connection who's unable to connect. And that was sort of the way into the character and the way into the story.
Nice. You mentioned that Evan is unable to connect, that he has a hard time with his peers, that he feels isolated, but the show doesn't explicitly diagnose what problem or problems Evan is having. Was that intentional? What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, it was intentional. I think we felt pretty early on that we liked the idea of leaving it vague enough. It's very specific in our minds as writers. Like, we know exactly what's going on,
right?
Or we feel that we do, but we like to leave room for the audience to bring their own experiences to the character and to see themselves in the character. And so somebody might come into the show and feel like, oh, that's like my brother, or that's like my sister, or my mom. And we don't want to kind of pigeonhole it into one thing. And also for the actor, I think it allows an opportunity. And if you see the show with multiple people playing the role of Evan, which I've had the privilege of doing at this point, it changes a little bit with everybody. And sort of that idea of like the diagnosis changes.
He seems, at times anxious, or maybe depressed, or maybe on the autism spectrum, or maybe just socially awkward. There's I could see like a lot of potential interpretations there. Dr. Koplewicz, can you tell us how common those types of symptoms or those types of experiences are among adolescents?
So I think that most of us don't realize that the most common illnesses of childhood and adolescence are mental health disorders. So there's 17 million kids in the United States who have one of these disorders. That's 1 out of 5. And you should compare that to other disorders. So there's 7 million kids who have asthma, or 200,000 with diabetes, and 15,000 with cancer. So by far, these are the most common. And the number one diagnosis from those 17 million is anxiety disorders. So when I was reading the script, I saw Evan as being anxious, also because over the arc of the show, which is about 2 years, he gets significantly less symptomatic. And people who have autism or are on the spectrum don't really get better in 2 years. But we also should recognize that left untreated, these kids get worse. So anxiety in childhood actually predisposes you for depression as a teenager. So that, when all those hormonal changes occur, your brain has now been prepped for depression. And depression is a terrible thing. It's not just being demoralized. It's not just being sad. It's affecting your sleep and your appetite and your sex drive and your ability to have pleasurable experiences. So I looked at the show and thought, optimistically, can't we see Evan get a lot better? And can he represent 5 million or 6 million of those 17 million kids? But I think remember, it's not only Evan. There's Connor in the show. There are many different teenagers there who are all struggling. They're all disconnected in so many different ways. And my favorite song, since I'm a parent, is when the two mothers turn to the audience and they sing a song, "Does anyone have a map?" And I think most parents of teenagers would like a map or a guidebook and especially if their kids have one of these disorders, they really feel lost.
It's interesting, the autism question is interesting because it's one that we definitely talked about as writers, and we always talk about with actors who are playing that part. Because I think it's the one thing that I feel pretty strongly Evan doesn't have.
Right. Yeah.
And that's because I think Evan's problem, if I understand correctly, and I'm not an expert, but autism has a lot to do with an inability to empathize or an inability to kind of imagine other people's interior lives. And Evan, I think, is the exact opposite. Evan is hyper-aware of other people's...
Overly
So he's
interested.
constantly... The problem with him is that he's overly empathetic. He already knows that you've rejected what he hasn't already said.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Absolutely.
So it's like,
Absolutely.
he's always like 10 steps behind.
Yes, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. Dr. Koplewicz, another question for you. These types of symptoms, anxiety, depression, isolation, as well as suicidal ideation, are those problems that are becoming more common among American kids and adolescents? Where's the...
Well, the numbers are definitely going up when you start looking at things like suicidal behavior. So in the last 4 years, the number of kids under the age of 14 to 18 who are going to emergency rooms because of suicidal thoughts or suicidal behavior has doubled. It's 1.2 million teenagers will go to an emergency room this year for suicidal thoughts or behavior. That's 1 every 30 seconds. And it was 600,000 4 years ago. But I think the other good news is that people are talking about it. So that while, I'm the oldest person on the stage, so I could tell you that people my age didn't talk about going to see a psychiatrist unless it was a psychoanalyst and it was kind of cool that you were learning more about yourself, but you didn't talk about seeing a tutor, and there were a lot of secrets. And I think that kids today, when you start talking about people between the ages of 12 and 18, would tell you they're seeing a psychiatrist or a psychologist. And I also think the internet has exposed us to, or Facebook or WhatsApp, Instagram, where people are telling their stories in a way that we never would have thought of. So I think there's more awareness, there's less shame among that age group, and therefore I think the numbers are higher. The problem is that there's a shortage of people who treat these things. There's only 8,500 child psychiatrists in the whole country. There are 5,000 people who are psychologists who did a year of child psychology. So we're left with a group of pediatricians who don't want to treat these disorders, and we're left with lots of kids who are symptomatic who need care. So this is still, I'm very glad Aspen Institute is doing mental health out of the shadows, but at the same time, it's a national epidemic. This is something that has to be addressed, and it can be addressed. We're a nation that took care of seatbelts. We're a nation that took care of AIDS. The AIDS was called GRID, gay-related immunodeficiency, so babies couldn't have GRID. We understood it's a virus. We gave it robust research. We have taken care of childhood cancer. St. Jude's has, in 70 years, has made pediatric leukemia go from killing 94 out of 100 kids to 4 out of 100 kids lose their lives. So this is something we can do. It's just, are we going to give it the resources? Are we going to give it the attention? Are we going to make it a priority?
Right. What kinds of things put kids at greater risk for the types of things Evan exhibits during the show?
So the bad news for all of us is that genes are very important. We can't be held responsible for our genes, but the way to think of it is nature loads the gun and the environment pulls the trigger, So clearly, if you are genetically loaded for this, you are more likely to get one of these disorders. And the interesting part is that anxiety, for instance, is only 35% genetic. The problem is there's something called assortative mating. People who are anxious find other people who are anxious to marry. People who have ADHD seem to find other people who have ADHD to marry. When I read the article 30 years ago, I thought, nonsense. Now I've been doing psychiatry for 30 years. It's amazing how you sit in an office and the father says, oh, I have that. And the mother says, my brother has that. And so how do they find each other? But there's something very attractive to them about those symptoms. So certainly genes play a part in it, but it's not 100%. And then I think that parenting can make things better. I don't think parents give you a psychiatric disorder, but parents can make the situation significantly better. And I think great parents, by the way, the parents in Dear Evan Hansen, I think are really good parents. They are somewhat lost, but they are trying. They are trying to figure out, is there a tutor? Is there a psychiatrist? Is there medicine? Is there therapy? Is there something that could make my kid's life less symptomatic and be able to be more fruitful and more productive? So the genes are definitely part of it, and your parents can decide to make it better or to make it worse. But if you think about your own parents, great parents accentuate your assets and minimize your deficits. So they get you a tutor for math if you can't do it, and if you've got a musical ear, hopefully they're getting you piano lessons. So it's the same thing, I think, with psychiatric disorders as well. It's just that it's much scarier. That the average parent in America waits 2 to 8 years from the onset of symptoms before they go see a mental health professional. So I think the stigma, the shame, the misinformation is really a problem. I mean, the fact that Dear Evan Hansen has done more than just a show, they partnered with us, the JED Foundation, the Trevor Project, Crisis Text Line. They've really tried very hard to take their celebrity and really give a spotlight to these organizations. They're working very hard on trying to find help for these kids.
Steven, on top of that, when you were trying to create this character, to create all of these characters, because as you mentioned, most everybody in the play is struggling with something at some level, aren't we all? And what are the challenges in writing people struggling with mental health problems in a sort of in a careful way?
Yeah, I mean, to us, the watchword was always authenticity. That was always like our big number one thing to keep in front of ourselves. People, especially young people, know when they're being condescended to or when they're being presented with cliches, and it's just not honest. So that was our main mission, was to make sure that young people and people who were experiencing these things could look and see themselves in it and not feel like it's an after-school special or it's exploitative. And I think, for me as a writer, I'm always just interested in what people want, and at the end of the day, like what people will do to get the love that they need, to get the recognition that they need, and all people are the same that way. And so these things are sort of obstacles in the way of that, or they're impairments that make that harder. But it's all really just the same human behavior filtered through these interesting problems.
Right, absolutely. In the play, Evan's life changes, if you haven't seen it, Evan's life changes after an acquaintance's suicide. How difficult was it to figure out how to write Evan's life, improving in some ways after a suicide? How difficult was that needle to thread?
Well, I think it's really difficult. Partly, I think one of the tricks of the show, is that Evan isn't really happy with his life after that. He creates this lie, or he sort of stumbles into a lie that balloons out of proportion, and he's unable to dig himself out of it and kind of keeps digging the hole deeper and deeper. And I think like any deal with the devil, it's mostly not that fun. It's like, like a lot of the show is actually Evan trying to get out of it, trying to figure out how to make it go away, and it just won't. So I think one of the things that the show hopefully shows in an entertaining way is his life, the happiness that he gets or the satisfaction is all very superficial. And in fact, all of his problems just become deeper and more insidious. And he really never addresses the core problem, which is his own self-hatred.
Right.
And he really only gets to that basically when the lie that he's created falls apart, and he realizes that the real lie is that he's happy with himself and that he's okay, and really what he needs to confront is the fact that he's not.
A lot of the things that happen in the play happen because of social media or because of the internet and because of how people are connected digitally in a way that they weren't previously. I know it's a contentious issue as to whether or not the internet contributes to people's alienation or helps people connect or some combination of them both. I'm interested in what both of you think about that.
I think from the beginning when we started talking about social media, we felt like there was a version of this musical that was very obvious and very easy to write as a satire of how ridiculous people are online and how they make up how happy they are, and it's so, isn't that silly, and aren't they crazy? And it felt like, okay, I know what that show is, I know that story, but what actually is the human impulse underneath it, the thing that actually, like, there's some need that it's fulfilling for us, that we would go so far as to lie or embellish or exaggerate online, which we all do. And that's really when the story kind of clicked for us, is that we felt like, oh, it's about connection. It's about our desperate desire to feel like we're part of something bigger.
Right.
And so in the show, what we do is we want to show how the internet can help people. And we sort of do that in this big number, You Will Be Found, where it really becomes this place of healing and connection, and people find each other. And then in the second act, the same thing sort of happens again, but instead of it being this love fest that's created online of people finding each other, it's the opposite, which is the other thing that the internet does very well, which is brings people together to destroy other people, and to shame other people, and becomes this kind of vicious, nasty circle. And I think that's the internet. I think it does both, and that's kind of the troubling thing about it is, the thing that I realized in working on this show is, like, all of these things, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, they're all neutral. Like, they have no moral feelings or slant. It's just us. So what we find on there is just ourselves. We're just looking back at ourselves, and we'll make it good or bad, but that's on us.
But the problem that we have with teenagers looking, projecting out onto themselves is that it's a very tough time. We were chatting about how high school might have been tough, but junior high school was impossible, and you're comparing yourself to other people, your growth spurt might not come in at the right time, you might not be good at something. And so I think that we know now from medicine that kids who spend more than 8 hours a day on the internet, which is not unusual, you can time this, are less happy, have less social interaction in real life than people who spend less. We get reports that they report that they have less interaction with their parents and less satisfying relationship with their parents. Which came first, which came second, I'm not sure. So while I don't think we have any evidence that time on the internet causes psychiatric illness, we think there's some correlation, if not cause and effect, and that anything that you're spending 8 hours on is too much. I just want to comment about the show for a second. I think what the show also does, what Steven has captured, is what adolescence is like. So some of the characters seem like caricatures, but they really are out there. So Evan has a friend, and the friend is kind of being foisted on him by the families because the families are friends. But in reality, people socialize, boys socialize on a totem pole. The coolest kid is on the top of the totem pole, and the most geeky kid is on the bottom of the totem pole. And if you're trying to get up that totem pole, you have to yank someone down and pull yourself up. So if your mom says, take Steven to the party, I'm friendly with his mother, I don't have enough power. I don't have enough tokens to pull him up. And so he's just a family friend. And, and then all of a sudden, Evan gets near the top of the totem pole, and he's the cool guy. That happens all the time in high schools, whether it's someone becomes cool over the summer because they become very handsome, or something happens to them because they mature. So it's captured, I think, beautifully what adolescence is all about. And then you put on top of it a suicide or an accidental death, a drug overdose, and how that contaminates everyone's life, and especially the parents' lives.
It also feels weird, like, about social media, that we've sort of all gone back to adolescence on social media. Like,
your life is just not that beautiful.
Do you know what I mean? Like, I feel like it's not a teenage phenomenon at all. Like, we're all on the same apps and looking at other people and thinking their lives are better and wondering what he's doing, or did I get invited to that party? And I do think there's like this weird infantilization that's...
The whole concept of FOMO is real.
Yeah.
The fear of missing out, which teenagers have. But I can't help but think, could they really be that happy? I mean, is their marriage so much better?
Yes, exactly.
Right, and you see that in the play with Connor's parents,
Yeah.
who are super successful and have a great house and a nice life, but the marriage is strained, and the mom is trying all kinds of wellness trends to try to make herself feel better.
Indeed.
Yeah, I thought that really underlined that nobody's doing as well as you think they might be.
Yeah, and I actually think one of the interesting responses to the show from younger people, I think some younger people who've grown up with social media always in their lives don't actually know that they're the only ones faking it online. Like, they actually think that they're the only ones who aren't really happy.
Right.
Which maybe we all sort of think deep down, that we're the only ones who are pretending like our life is perfect on Instagram.
Right.
It's just so fascinating that way.
It is, because you see your interior and everybody else's exterior.
Yes.
Which leads into the next thing I wanted to talk about, which is the ability for these kinds of pieces of art to affect stigma. How do you think, Dr. Koplewicz, how do you think these types of representation, what do they potentially mean to kids who are struggling?
So I think they're very powerful. First of all, if you haven't seen the show, you think of musicals, at least my thought is always a musical comedy. This is a musical drama. You're sitting in the theater and people are crying. And
it's funny too.
Yeah,
it is.
Funny.
You should go see the show, But it's really amazing how emotional it can get. But I also think that if you feel totally alone and you're experiencing something all by yourself, that no one else has depression, no one else has ADHD, no one has dyslexia, I am in this struggle by myself, seeing someone survive, seeing someone thrive under adversity when they're a teenager is very important. We spend a lot of time at the Child Mind Institute on public awareness. So in the month of May, we get 40 famous people to do a video, a 30-second to 60-second video, talking to their younger self about their struggle with mental health or with a learning disorder. We got 4 billion media impressions in 2017 and again in 2018 when we did it. And this year, we decided to get more we got people who are influential on the internet. So I've never heard of them, but they have 5 million people following them.
Right.
And that helps a lonely boy or a lonely girl who thinks, I'm never getting out of this. I feel so hopeless. And hopelessness, by the way, is the #1 symptom that causes people to try to hurt themselves. And so the idea that you could have a Broadway show or a video or TV programs that talk about how real it is without sugarcoating it and saying, it's a tunnel, but you can get out of it. There is light. It doesn't feel like it. And I think this is very powerful. And I think the movie is going to obviously have a greater effect because so many more eyeballs will see that, people who can go to the theater.
Right.
So we just have to wait for a movie. That's a hint for him, but he's not going to take it.
How real do you think the characters in the show are?
I actually thought Evan was very real, but Connor is this very angry, conduct disordered, that scary kid that is wearing black nail polish and he's menacing. In fact, he menaces Evan, and he's using drugs and he's been in and out of a drug treatment program. Those kids are really out there, and they look like they're in charge when they're really terribly alone. There's another character who's building her resume all the time. Do you mean she has to be close to the dead boy. She has to be the vice president, the president. And there's a whole bunch of very insecure kids out there who demonstrate their anxiety by this exaggeration of wanting to belong. And I think that Jared, the best friend or the friend, also has, I want to belong, so I'm not sure I can make you belong. I found it exceptionally real. In fact, it's cringeworthy at times. You think to yourself, oof, I do remember that, And it's quite interesting how humans kind of forget those horrible moments of junior high and high school, and for good reason. It's very protective, because, your kids are going to have to go through it, and you want to have a more positive attitude. But this show, I think, captures that, and I think that's why it's so real for teenagers. And I think you should talk about, the kind of notes that the original Evan was getting about how his experience was affecting other people.
Yeah, well, that was actually, that's sort of when it became real, for me at least. Because we started this show, when we started writing this show, we always, this is the worst pitch for a musical that you can imagine. It's about a kid who kills himself and then another kid who lies about being friends with him. I mean, that sounds really terrible.
Right.
So we thought for a long time, we were really passionate about it, obviously, and believed in the story and these characters, but we just never knew how many people would respond to the show or if we'd ever have any response. And then when it got to Broadway, within the first few weeks, you could just feel that something was happening. And then Ben Platt, who was the original Evan on Broadway, wrote the three of us writers that he'd gotten this letter sent to his dressing room to backstage that was anonymous. And it just said, because of you, I didn't let go. Which I still get goosebumps when I think about it, every time I tell that story. Because in the show, that's actually a metaphor that's used as, climbing the tree and letting go, or do you keep going? And when you feel like, somebody actually found the language that we used helpful in voicing their own feelings and their own struggles, that's profound. It feels really humbling. I think that's when we all realized that, and we, the writers, the actors, that we had a huge responsibility. And actually, as soon as the show got to Broadway especially, the actors, every night at the stage door, people would come up to them and share incredibly personal stories and incredibly personal struggles. And we realized pretty soon that we needed to give the actors the tools to know how to navigate those conversations and get people the help they needed and not present themselves as experts. Right. So that was something that we had to do was, I think it may have been someone from the Jed Foundation.
I think so.
That came in and spoke to the actors and said, this is what you say in that situation. And this is how you get someone the help that they need and don't not steer them the wrong way, which is, these are just actors playing these characters, you know what I mean? But you see them for 2.5 hours and you feel like, oh, me,
Absolutely.
It's kind of interesting because I was writing back and forth different parts as the script was moving along, but then you go opening night and that first song, and I remember leaning over to someone, I think Bloomingdale's was very involved with the Child Mind Institute and was involved with Dear Evan Hansen. I leaned over to the CEO and I said, I think this is a phenomena, and this guy is now going to be a star. Do you mean? Because all of a sudden, he came out, no one applauded. When he finished, people were roaring. And then if you see the show 3 weeks or 4 weeks later, he comes out and they start applauding before he sings the first note. So something happened, and it definitely has something to do with also young people, because I watched how there was a crowd outside that stage door where people just wanted to touch him. And he wasn't famous yet. I think they just so identified with his struggle. Not his struggle, but Evan's struggle.
When you have a piece of art like this that really inspires people and touches people and addresses something that's so real and so potentially dangerous, how do you go about transferring that connection into something that's sort of functionally useful for those people? How do you get organizations or doctors involved or resources?
Well, from the very beginning, our producer, Stacey Mindich, partnered with the organizations that you talked about, and also Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation. And we have links to all of those groups all over the website, in the program. And then we have merchandise every year, the proceeds of which go to, I think, the Crisis Text Hotline. And then we also do things like this. We had an event with Time Magazine.
Which we spent practically half a day.
Yeah.
Where we not only spoke to each other, but there were kids in the audience, there were other foundations there. Really trying
broadcast on
their
Facebook,
on Time, Facebook
Yeah.
and Time's Facebook. But the concept was you are not alone. So it wasn't about selling tickets. It was a matter of kids should know you're not alone. And if you feel alone, here are organizations that can really help you. And I think that's unique. I don't think you usually find Broadway shows doing that. But I think this is, as well as being funny, the fact that it's so poignant and so moving, I think makes it a very special vehicle and therefore has more responsibility to do something.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Do you think American culture is making progress on stigma? Do you think that a show like this and its popularity is evidence of that, or?
I think we have a long way to go.
Yeah.
And I'll give you the example that every year getting 40 celebrities or influential people to give us the video, people say yes, then they say no. I've had managers of famous celebrities say to me, how could you say she has an anxiety disorder? She doesn't have an anxiety disorder. I said, she's not my patient. It was in People magazine. That's why, don't tell people. I mean, I didn't tell people. You told people, and like, how is that going to hurt her that she has an anxiety disorder? I think people like her more if she had an anxiety disorder. So they're clearly, it's not. Emma Stone has joined the board of the Child Mind Institute. It's a very big deal for a movie star to take full responsibility, to make the financial contribution, to be out there. And I'm sure that her manager and agent weren't happy about this. I think it would have been much easier if she did St. Jude's. It's kind of like people know St. Jude's. And Emma actually said, I struggle with an anxiety disorder. I wish when I was in Arizona as a little girl, there was a Child Mind Institute, if we knew more. And she said the most amazing thing. She's 30 years old, and she said, I'm famous, but I want to be significant. And if I get involved with institutions like this, I will be able to become more of a significant positive force. So I think we're making progress, but she's 30. And the managers that we talk to sometimes are 60 or 70. So I don't think people stand up right away and say, I struggled with anxiety, or I struggled with ADD, or I have dyslexia. And you're amazed, the governor of Colorado, Gavin Newsom, is very outspoken about the fact that he has dyslexia, and it has motivated him to spend a tremendous amount of resources on brain health. Mm-hmm. That kids who have dyslexia most of the time don't graduate high school. So the fact that we have some of these brave heroes, these change makers, makes a big difference. Kevin Love, by the way, Cleveland Cavalier, changing the National Basketball Association, saying, I have an anxiety disorder, I need treatment, I can't be a great basketball player unless I get treated. And athletes don't like to show weakness. Mm-hmm. It's not good for the game.
Right. How much do you think the stereotypes about people with mental illness contribute to stigma?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of that. I think the whole idea of crazy, I think, the fact that someone has an anxiety, so I think there's two things that have changed. Number one, pharmaceutical companies are now allowed to advertise to the general public. And in some ways, that has minimized how serious some of these disorders are. So there was an advertisement for Paxil where they show someone walking into a cocktail party and say, haven't you ever felt when you walked into a cocktail party, there was a spotlight on you, you didn't know what to do with your hands, you didn't know what to talk to? Everyone feels that. Right. That's not Paxil. That's not social anxiety. Right. That's a bad cocktail party. That's like, I don't like lawyers, and why did they take me here, and I'm not wearing the right clothes, and I need a drink, and I'll feel better. But social anxiety can be as severe as Evan Hansen, and it can we have kids who are selectively mute, who literally will talk to mom and dad, but will go to school and will not talk to anyone, and they would rather not they won't raise their hand to go to the bathroom because people will look at them, and they will urinate on themselves instead of raising their hand. And so you can see how quickly they're going to stop going to school. They're serious disorders, and I think someone can have a serious disorder and still not be crazy. Do you know what I mean? I think when we think about crazy, I think we think about schizophrenia, where you're hearing voices, you're seeing things that are not real, and you're experiencing them as real. And yet, we still have people who have schizophrenia who've won the Nobel Prize. When they're treated and you can get their symptoms under control, they can still be brilliant, or they can still be great artists. So I think we have to come out of the shadows. But I think that requires almost a national movement. It can't just be the Child Mind Institute, or it can't just be Dear Evan Hansen. It has to be, I think, American parents demanding that their health insurance should be equal for mental health as it is for physical health, that there has to be some kind of forgiveness for people who go to medical school and become a child psychiatrist, or go get a PhD and become a child psychologist, to pay off their loans, to motivate them to do this. And I think also pediatricians have to be paid more money if they'll train in, at least in the identification of ADD, depression, anxiety, and autism. Let them take the big four so that we have a real shot here. I mean, it's really, if you think about the fact that 5,000 teenagers will kill themselves this year, and 5,000 killed themselves last year, and that's been going on for 25 years, that's more kids dying from suicide than all the kids who will die from AIDS, cancer, diabetes combined. I mean, this is, and yet we wouldn't tolerate that, right? And we feel sorry for the kids who are bald and have cancer, and I think St. Jude's is terrific, but I do think that my kids count also. Do you mean? And there are more of them. So I think we have to do something really radical. I mean, and it's really interesting that many first ladies have done that. If you think about Rosalind Carter, she's been more outspoken about mental illness than anybody. And Barbara Bush talked about her own depression. But we've never had, a presidential commission or a Senate leader saying, let's take this on. And I think the number one thing would be parity. If you had if physical illness was equal to mental illness in how you get reimbursed by an insurance company, that would certainly be the first place to start.
Why do you think we're behind so far on mental illness?
So I think the brain is the most complicated organ. It's hard to understand. We don't have a biomarker. So if everyone starts coughing here in the room, you don't all have pneumonia, right? So you don't all get penicillin. And the way we could figure out who does have pneumonia and who has a virus and who has an allergy is we take a little bit of your white blood cells, and bingo, the people with the allergies get the antihistamines, the virus, you all get tea and rest, and only the people with pneumonia get the penicillin. If you're all inattentive, you don't all have ADHD. You might be bored, you might be anxious, you might be gifted, you might be learning disabled, but you shouldn't all get Ritalin. And yet we don't have that biomarker. So we still have to do diagnosis the old-fashioned way, which is history taking, which is what medicine always does. So if I have chest pain now that's radiating down my left arm and it feels like an elephant is sitting on my chest, we go with a heart attack. That's number one. We don't say heartburn or something I ate, but nevertheless, we have an EKG that can confirm it. We can have a blood test. So we need to spend a lot more money, I think, and we're getting there. So the idea that functional MRIs and EEGs and maybe genetics and will help us with that, I think that will make it much more real. I think it's easy to stigmatize something that seems not objective, and it's a lot harder to do that with cancer. And cancer 50, 60 years ago, we whispered it. We called it the big C. Once we got better understanding of it, it really made a difference. I think autism is maybe the best thing that we've changed, and that was we used to blame mothers for a child who had autism. They were called icebox moms, mothers that didn't pick up their children enough. That's what created autism. And now we have CAT scans and MRIs, and we can show the difference in the brain of a child who has autism versus a typically developing child. That right away relieves the parents of the guilt and makes it much easier to go get help. But it's not the way we make the diagnosis. I think that's one of the big things that we have to change. You should know I'm always optimistic. I started a not-for-profit in 2009 in the middle of an economic tsunami. So it's like, I'm constantly optimistic of people like Steven writing shows like this, of the Aspen Institute finally saying mental health out of the shadows, and the fact that there are people here who hopefully will continue and be able to say, I'm not ashamed of my kid. My kid has this, and I'm going to get treatment, and he or she is going to get better.
Right. When you were writing Dear Evan Hansen, was all of this on your mind? Like, how do you step into such a fraught, widespread issue like this and try to winnow it down to a set of experiences?
It really wasn't on our minds.
Okay.
I mean, we never thought that we were writing a show about mental health or a show about suicide or depression or social anxiety, which I think is maybe good. I mean, I think when you approach art from the perspective of, like, here's the issue I'm going to talk about, or this character represents, that's usually bad art, you know? I know that what we did along the way that was, I'm very grateful that our producer had the foresight to do this, is things like, we gave the script to you to take a look at and see what seemed like, oh, this wouldn't quite be the way that this would happen, or...
and yet, he didn't listen to everything I wrote.
Right, that's true.
Because he was writing the show, it's like...
and also...
We don't always take our edits.
No. Yes.
And correctly so,
Yes. But things like that, and I think, I don't know, I feel very fortunate or lucky that we somehow got it right enough, and I guess we had really careful people around us who were really, who could be outside of it enough to view it that way.
Right. That totally makes sense. One issue in Evan Hansen that comes up sort of, not central, but it does come up is medication. When we meet Evan, he is on some sort of medication. It's not specified what, but he does take medication and see a doctor. After Connor's suicide, when he's puffing himself up a little bit and feeling a little bit more confident in certain things, he goes off his medication without telling anybody. How did you make that decision as a writer for him to do that?
Well, that was one thing that we disagreed on.
Right. So I read it and said the kid has social anxiety. The drug he must be taking must be an SSRI, a Prozac-like drug. You can, if you stop Prozac or Zoloft or any one of these medicines cold, you very often will get withdrawal symptoms. You're going to feel crummy. You're going to have a stomach ache, and I also hate the idea that we would be showing kids that you just stop your medicine, right? Because as someone who sometimes writes prescriptions for patients, I don't want them to do that. Steven just ignored that. And so on opening night, I remember saying, congratulations, wonderful. I don't know if he remembers this, but I said, what happened with the medicine? And your line was, poetic license. But obviously it wasn't Prozac.
To me, what I like about it is that Evan is in denial.
Right.
That Evan is doing something stupid.
Right.
He's having a moment of, which I think often happens with people
Who'd
when things start to improve, that you think, oh, well, the medication I don't really need because everything's going well.
Right.
And I think that's masking the real problem. So I don't think it's a good moment in the show.
Right.
That's recommended. But I liked that he was doing something reckless, because it makes me feel like, ooh, this is not good, as an audience member.
Right. Is that something you see a lot with patients?
Yeah, so, I can't tell you how often once a patient feels better, they somehow, so let me preface this. The Child Mind Institute does not take money from the pharmaceutical industry. We also don't take money from guns, liquor, or tobacco. But the most impressive part is we don't let pharmaceutical representatives on the grounds of the Child Mind Institute, because they inevitably are handsome or beautiful, very seductive. They have pens with them, pizza, Post-its, and a check. And so this is not good, because somehow you're all of a sudden writing prescriptions for something that you weren't going to write before. And personally, I like old medicines. I like medicines that have been given to 1 million other kids before I give them to one of my patients. But, you know, and Lexapro and Prozac are not that different, in the same way that Adderall is not that different from Dexedrine, and Concerta is not that different from Ritalin. They're just new formulas. So that's number one. But I can tell you that there is still a stigma about it and a feeling of weakness. And also, it must be real. I must have a real mental health disorder if I'm taking a pill every day. And if I don't take the pill every day, well, maybe it wasn't a real mental health, maybe it was just a phase again. And I think that goes back to that stigma part. So frankly, I'd rather have someone say to me, I don't want to really take the medicine, so fine, why don't we figure out a way for you to get off of it in a careful way that isn't going to cause any ill effects. But that's not often what happens. And parents are not, you know, they're not in a psychiatric hospital. They're at home, and parents at a certain point want to trust their teenager that if they're taking the medicine, they're taking the medicine. So that, it happens to be very realistic what he wrote. I just don't like it.
Right.
You know, and he didn't,
Exactly,
and he said, too bad. So,
Yeah, right.
So it does happen frequently. And what usually happens is a relapse. So all of a sudden, you're washing your hands more often if you have OCD, or you're finding yourself being more reticent and you're not able to speak up, or very often kids who have separation anxiety, kids who are afraid to be apart from their parents, they have school phobia, it comes roaring back. And remember, these are very long-acting medicines. Prozac has no street value. Do you mean you're not going to say, take this pill, in 6 weeks you're going to feel great? You know, somehow it just doesn't, you know, we don't worry about pot stores selling Prozac. So what you have is it starts dropping, and then 2 weeks later, the kid's symptoms have come back. And that's when you say, have you been taking your medicine? You know, you say, well, I didn't really want to.
Yeah.
Do you think the public's understanding of psychiatric medication is improving at all, or are people more nervous about more pills than?
Yeah, so I think people are very anxious about this. In fact, I can't tell you how often a parent says to me, we don't believe in medication. You know, I feel like it's okay. Unlike psychoanalysis, which you really have to believe in for it to work, the medicine will work even if you don't believe in it. And so it's perfectly okay. But you find yourself having to be very respectful of the fact that some parents will not give their kids medication. And whether I think some of these pills are life-saving doesn't change their point of view. And so if you look at what's happened to the field, the really great advances have come in psychosocial interventions. These psychologists like Aaron Beck, who invented cognitive behavioral therapy, or Marshall Linehan, who invented dialectical behavioral therapy, or a whole bunch of people who do parent management training, who in 8 to 10 sessions can do wonders for a parent who has a kid who's very oppositional and defiant or has ADHD. But for certain disorders like depression, or for very severe ADHD, if you don't take the medicine, I feel in some ways you're being terribly neglectful. It's like saying, take off your glasses. You know, squint. You know, it's better if you squint. And somehow the message comes through, you're less than if you have to take the medicine, which you would never do if your kid has strep throat. You would give them the penicillin, or God forbid they have cancer, and you would say, well, we just don't believe in chemotherapy. You know, okay, we'll do radiation, we'll do surgery, but the chemotherapy will really treat them. So I think part of that is that we don't understand, you know, we haven't, I don't think we've done a good enough job in the mental health field explaining what's going on. And considering how cool neuroscience is lately, I think we could do a much better job, and that might alleviate some of the fears. There's also a myth. Parents are convinced that if you give your kid medicine, you're teaching them how to take drugs. And so I don't want my kid becoming a drug addict. And the evidence is exactly the opposite. So we have terrific evidence that if you took Ritalin at 6 for ADHD, you are less likely as a teenager or an adult to use illicit drugs than if you took the medicine and waited till you were 12 years of age. So the pills are actually sometimes good at preventing substance abuse instead of creating it. But this is going to take more public awareness.
I feel like the pharmaceutical companies aren't helpful.
No, they're not.
Though.
No.
Because it's exactly what you're saying. You know, people see the pens and they see the Post-it notes,
Right.
and it creates this sense of conspiracy. And
the interesting part is they have invested almost nothing in central nervous system drugs. The fact that I'm telling you that Prozac and Lexapro are almost identical medicine, they're not having scientists work on this, or that, by the way, Dexedrine was released in 1937. Ritalin was released in the late 1950s. Prozac came out in 1986. My toolbox is very weak when it comes to medicine. So if I don't have really great psychologists who know how to do psychosocial interventions, the pharmaceutical industry is not helping us. So the fact that we have old drugs being repackaged with 1 or 2 molecule changes isn't helping.
Yeah. What kind of impact does playing these characters have on the actors
That's a great question.
that plays them?
Josh would know better than I do. But I do know it's really hard. It's very, very difficult. It's very draining, depending on which part you play. I mean, this is the thing that as a writer you forget, is that you're not doing it 8 times a week, 8 times a week, which is just remarkable, and especially the part of Evan, which we learned after Ben that nobody could ever play that part 8 times a week again. It's now, I think everybody plays it about 6 times a week, and then there's an alternate who does 2 times a week. But part of what's hard about it, aside from the vocal challenges, is it's a really hard place to go emotionally, once or twice a day. And then I know for Ben, who I've probably spoken to the most about it because I was there as it was kind of being, created, and then as he was inhabiting it for the first time, it's really hard to be in this role and also have to protect your voice. And so for Ben, it was really isolating because he would do the show and then have to go home and be silent until the next one. So it's like this incredibly emotional experience. You really go to a dark place, and then you have to be alone and quiet for 24 hours. So it's hard. And I know for the parents, it's hard too.
But I think Ben also started to talk openly. I mean, he started talking about his own fight with anxiety.
Totally.
And depression as a teenager. So I think it must make you raw. I mean, in a way that other parts don't.
Yes. I mean, what actors do is really incredible all the time.
The person who's playing Connor now on Broadway did one of these videos for us, dealing with his anxiety disorder. And he was super cool about it.
Yeah.
But I can't imagine playing 8 times a week someone who takes a drug overdose, who has struggled with anxiety for at least 10 years.
I think people in the arts in general, as I was saying, I mean, depression and anxiety are very common. And it's surprising how common anxiety is among actors, because you would think they're so confident, they have, they're able to get out there and speak to people, but I find that it's
But I think you give
so common.
But remember, you gave him a script. I think it's much easier
Absolutely.
to be whoever you told me to be versus being who I am. And so it always amazes me when I talk to an actor and they seem uncomfortable.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, and they're awkward, and you think, I think the best one is, I'm blocking on his name right now, who played Casanova and Brokeback Mountain.
Heath Ledger?
Heath Ledger was incredibly uncomfortable socially, and yet give him a script, and I believe, you're Casanova, absolutely. And I think, it's your words, not his words. That's the difference. So. And I think that's true for people with social anxiety. If you give them a script or you give them a song, they go on a stage, and then they can't do the chit-chat afterwards.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. It does seem that people who struggle with mental health issues are particularly sometimes attracted to creative endeavors and creative expression and things like that. Theater is popular among kids who are having a hard time in high school, and
Totally.
What is that? Why does stuff like this in particular, do you think, resonate?
Well, I would tell you that unfortunately, mental health disorders are equal opportunity disorders. So there's a whole bunch of people who can't sing a song who are struggling with a mental health disorder. And there's also a whole bunch of boring people who have a mental health disorder also. So, I mean, I think that if you're one of those creative people, you then think that other people have it too. I interviewed Orlando Bloom, and he said, I think the reason my dyslexia makes me such a great actor is it gives me so much more passion, et cetera. And I think it's a gift. And our middle son has dyslexia, and so he met Orlando Bloom, and he said, did you tell my father dyslexia is a gift? And he said, yes. And he went into this whole thing. He said, well, if it's a gift, could you just tell me where I could return it? Because I hate taking so long to read a chapter or to write a paper. And so I think if you have one of these disorders, sometimes you have to live with it. These are chronic. They're not real quick fixes, even with medicine. And so therefore, you have to make the best of it. And hopefully you will be more compassionate to other people, or you'll use the assets you have, whether it's acting or math or whatever it is. But I don't think it's a natural that because you have the deficit, you get the asset. And because I think that's unfair, because there's a whole bunch of people who have average IQs and who get stuck with these disorders, and it makes their lives significantly more difficult to be in school because they're dealing with these other problems.
Right.
But obviously, just like there are people who are great athletes or great actors who have these disorders, they're moving to their strength, which is what a good doctor tries to do, is get them not to mull over or just live with this bad disorder, but to try to use whatever their strengths are to make them feel good.
Do you think that there's a danger in people deciding that their creativity is their mental health issue, or their talent or their identity is their mental health issue?
Go for it, Steven.
Yes, I think it's very. The last project I worked on was the show Fosse Verdon, which is a lot about somebody who felt that his pathologies were intimately related to his creativity. And I think the problem with that is, first of all, I just think it's not true. And I think it's a mythology.
Yeah.
And you can just point to all of the people for whom that isn't true to
Right.
show that you don't need to be. I just think it's such a dangerous idea, and it's one that's so pervasive. And it's particularly, I think, for men. It's like that, the torture genius male artist. Which not only, I think, aids and abets
Bad behavior.
very bad behavior, but I think it makes people think they need to be sick in order to create things. And I've found the opposite to be true, especially knowing sick people, people who get sick while they're creating, addicts and people that deal with these disorders. It's not easy, that's a bad combination.
And I think that there can be very mentally healthy people who can be obnoxious and cruel and mean and not have a mental health disorder. And you can have people who have a mental health disorder who are remarkably creative, who are the kindest people you have ever met. And it's not because of their mental health disorder. Part of it's their personality, it was the way they were raised, it's their empathy, which they're struggling with because they're having so much trouble with their own lives, but they still manage to be empathic, wonderful human beings.
The last topic I want to hit before we go to some audience Q&A, get your questions ready, is interventions in ways that you can help people, ways that you can step in to either to help kids, to help your friends. For adolescents in particular, who may hide these issues from their parents, who may not be explicit about what the problems they're having. How can kids help other kids? What is the role there?
We should definitely give, first of all, I think telling kids it's okay to speak up when you're worried about a friend, that you're not being a snitch or you're not being a bad friend, you're being a good friend if a friend's talking about suicide or a friend's talking about depressed stuff, or your friend's disappeared on you, where he's no longer going to football practice or she won't do homework with you. And it makes sense to speak up, to tell your parents, to have them tell their parents. But there is there are two teenagers in the audience who've come up with an app called I Am Not Okay. And if you want to know more about it, they're going to have a presentation, I think, tomorrow, or is it Saturday? Tomorrow. But the whole idea that teenagers made an app that they tell 5 or 6 of their closest friends or family members that they can get a text saying, I'm not okay, please check on me. And so again, that gives license and permission for teenagers to say, it doesn't always have to be perfect. There can be bad times, but the most important one is you should reach out and ask for help. There's no need, you don't get extra credit for suffering. There's nothing special about suffering. So. And also, I think the message should also be treatment works. I mean, if you have an anxiety disorder, go back to Evan, and you get it properly diagnosed, and you get cognitive behavioral therapy for 12 weeks, along with Prozac-like medication, 81% of kids get better. What other disease has an 81% treatment response in 12 weeks? And if you have depression, it's a 71% treatment response. So treatment works. And that's another message that we have to, you don't have to suffer like this.
Mm-hmm. And for parents, I empathize, I don't have kids, but I empathize so much with the parents in Dear Evan Hansen because they seemed like they were genuinely trying their best and just didn't know what to do. What should parents be doing? If they have resources to do something, what is the first step in helping a kid?
So I think number one is if you are in doubt, you call your pediatrician and ask them, you tell them symptoms that are bothering you, things that you see are changed in your child. We've had 1 million people have come to a symptom checker we have at childmind.org to see if the symptoms mean something. And you take that piece of paper that you print out and you go to your pediatrician and you say, I'm genuinely worried, this is based on my report. And I think hesitating is the worst thing. The idea that people wait 2 years to 7 years to get help is the biggest mistake. The second thing parents have to do is they have to be an informed consumer. You just don't go into the first doctor without checking some questions. Have you done this before? What are the treatment choices we'll have? What is the prognosis? I always compare it to going to an architect. If you're redoing your kitchen, you would ask your architect, have you done kitchens before? If they tell you to do skyscrapers, you say thank you and you go on. And if they tell you they don't know how long it's going to take and how much it's going to cost, you're not going to start the renovation of your kitchen. And I think you owe it to your child to say, best estimate, how long do you think it's going to take for you to come up with a diagnosis, and how long will it take for you to come up with a treatment that's going to show some symptom relief, that my kid is going to feel better? Is it going to be a month? Is it going to be 2 months? And if someone can't give you those answers, I think you have to go find another doctor. I think parents have to be, and remember how scared the parents are in Dear Evan Hansen. So you're not usually in the mindset of being assertive and saying, I need to ask the right questions here.
Mm-hmm. How did you go into writing the parents in Dear Evan Hansen? What did you consider? Because like I said, I felt like they were sort of such a nice mix between trying hard and trying hard in a really human way.
Yeah.
How did you? What was your process there?
Well, there are no bad guys in the show, and everybody's trying their best in flawed ways, and I wanted them all to be really good parents. I think in a way they are all really good parents in their own flawed ways. I mean, with the Murphys, I think you have this situation that's Connor's parents where they just didn't know what to do with this kid. They have another daughter that has basically been neglected because they don't have time or energy for her. And then Evan's mom is overextended and trying to put food on the table, and that's a very real issue. And so I guess in talking about the parents, we wanted them all to be human and relatable and trying their best and just as ill-equipped as we all are to deal with life, and I think the thing with Heidi that I think about Evan's mom is that she tries again and again and again, and it doesn't really work most of the time, and she constantly messes up, but she's always putting herself back out there. She's always knocking again.
I think it's very easy for someone to say, oh, well, she forgot that she was going to work and she's going to miss a dinner with Evan. That's not what causes that doesn't cause a psychiatric disorder, because then my children would really be in trouble. So, we all overbook. We all get demands at work. I think that, for most of us who have typical kids, you can be a sub-average parent. You can get away with stuff. But if you have a child with one of these extraordinary disorders, you have to be better than average parenting. And these parents are trying. I mean, I thought when the father there's this whole thing with the mitt. He desperately wanted to have a relationship with Connor, and he's describing a kid who didn't want to play baseball and didn't want to connect with his dad, and how frustrated it was for him. And what do you do if you're a parent whose kid seems so detached from you? But again, it's not the fact that they didn't have a catch in the backyard that caused this problem. And with the Murphys, you get the impression they sent him to some drug rehab, which is a fortune. I mean, your health insurance doesn't pay for it. So they're making financial sacrifices, and they still don't seem to be getting the tools they need to deal with this very extraordinary child.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, if there's not anything else you guys want to say about that, I think we can take some audience questions. We have microphones coming, I believe.
Hi, I'm Georgina Levy. I live in Aspen, and I've lived here my whole life. I'm part of a grassroots organization, although not formally, but my son's in a therapeutic place in Montana, there are a lot of other families in the valley who have the same issue. And some of us are trying to work on what happens when we know we need help for our kids, but we can't really tap into the resources because they're just not there for us the way we need them to be. But as much as it is an access issue, it's also a financial issue. And some of us have been able to figure out very creative ways to make it happen. And then there's others that I know and work with as an education advocate who just can't. And do you have any kind of pathways to consider for those families who really have such a hard time accessing resources?
Yeah, so this is a real problem. And so what and on top of that, in Aspen, which is still such a small place, it's really problematic. So if you're in a city, I always say you should definitely go to an academic medical center. They get real tax benefits for being a not-for-profit, and therefore they have to provide care, whether it's a resident or a fellow doing it. And that presents a problem. I think also fighting with your insurance company does make sense. They respond to the squeaky wheel, and if you can give them evidence that your child has a disorder, you get the pediatrician to write it, or someone to say, this is our, they can make a diagnosis, and we need help because without the help, my kid's going to drop out of school. It is very impressive how they'll do one-offs. They don't want to change their policy, but you really have to be very assertive as a parent to get help. And if you can get the help, then you need to make sure it's good help. You're in a tremendous dilemma here because it's such a small place. It's significantly easier in cities right now. But I would start with fighting with the insurance company to get them whatever they need to make an exception for you.
I have a question about the portrayal of mental health in other shows. We saw Evan Hansen with Ben Platt, and it felt extremely real and very moving. And I contrast that with watching the portrayal of schizophrenia in Homeland, and I'm wondering if you find that was anything as close to reality as your show was.
So I think in Homeland, I believe her diagnosis they're trying to do is manic depressive illness, is bipolar disorder. And quite clearly, it's an adult who also stops taking her medicine. So for a quick primer, bipolar disorder is manic depressive illness. It's been around for a very long period of time as a diagnosis. Treatment, the drug of treatment is lithium. A very famous Broadway producer by the name of Joshua Logan really made it very public and said that without lithium, he was hospitalized every year, and with lithium, he was able to produce, I think it was Oklahoma. Yeah. And yet, any drug you take may have side effects. Lithium can be toxic to your kidneys, and over time can actually destroy a kidney. So you have to do blood tests all the time. This is not an easy medicine to administer. I think the problem with Homeland is, from a psychiatrist's point of view, is you have someone who won't accept their illness. I mean, if you have bipolar disorder and you have a child and you can't work for the CIA. I mean, it's like, it's great television. I kind of like it a lot, but it's, and the CIA is not checking, I don't think they hire many people who are taking and I think she also takes antipsychotic medicine too. So I think that's the dilemma. I think they're trying to do a very good job with it. I think one of the worst portrayals of a treatment that has affected America's image is One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. So electroconvulsive therapy, shock therapy, is one of the most effective treatments for depression. When they do surveys of psychiatrists and ask psychiatrists, what treatment would you pick if you were becoming psychotically depressed? Overwhelmingly, they say, give me a trial of ECT. Because we know that when you get ECT, A, you have general anesthesia, you're out cold. Number two, the seizure that you have isn't that you're jumping up and down, it's your toe, your big toe moves a little bit. That's the evidence of a seizure. And that after 8 sessions, you are significantly better. It has side effects. It causes memory loss that takes a long time to get back those short-term memory. Which is a real problem, obviously, but it's a very effective treatment. You look at One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and it looks like a punishment. They're shocking him while he's up. It really has done a tremendous disservice, particularly in adult psychiatry. It's very rarely used in teenagers, but it's really effective. And that kind of bad portrayal affects America's idea about, first of all, psychiatrists. It makes us look like we're sadists, and I like one of my favorite movies when I was in training was Ordinary People. But the problem with Ordinary People is that all Judd Hirsch does is hug kids. It's like, I want to do that. You hug kids, they get better. It doesn't work. The hugging just doesn't work. And now I'm afraid to hug people. So, it's like, so now I wouldn't even have my treatment. So, yeah.
Probably to the doctor. How do you feel about someone who has severe anxiety and their behavior is bad towards others, family members, and they never take responsibility? Yeah. What are your thoughts?
So I think you have to separate two things, okay? First of all, I think most people think when you're anxious, you're going to be, contained and you're going to be meek. And it's hard for people to understand that you can be very disruptive. In fact, the article that gets read the most on childmind.org is disruptive behavior as a symptom of an anxiety disorder, because it's so hard to understand. So I think number one is the anxiety disorder or any psychiatric disorder. Secondly is the behavior, bad behavior or good behavior toward family members. And so I think that, if someone's ill and they're trying their best and they're still very difficult to live with, I think we should be very understanding. I think when someone is not is not going for treatment or taking the medicine or whatever's been prescribed, and they are very difficult to live with, there reaches a point where a family member has to set some limits. And this is very hard, because the part that I think most people have trouble with psychiatric illness, it affects your judgment. Your judgments in your brain. When you have cancer, you're on the side of the doctor. The doctor and you are fighting cancer. And very often when you have psychiatric illness, the doctor's on the opposite, the patient's with the illness. You're thinking, wait, you're supposed to be on my side. I'm going to beat this with you. And they keep saying, no, there's nothing wrong with me. I don't need the medicine. And it's the fact that the disease itself affects the patient's judgment. So these diseases affect families. The way he talks about the sister of Connor, kids get ignored. People really feel marriages get affected. Kids who have psychiatric disorders. Connor, Evan's parents are divorced before the episode, but you can imagine having one of these kids is very trying on any family. But we have higher rates of divorce among the kids who have serious psychiatric disorders. There's a question behind you, I think.
Hi, my name is Lanchi Christie-Vo. I am the medical director of telehealth for Children's Hospital Philadelphia.
Okay.
And relating to the access question to mental health for children, I like to point out that, I think telemedicine, telehealth, telebehavioral health, psychiatry could lower the barrier entry for that. And I advocate for that on a legislative perspective. I think overall in general in a nation, there's not mental health parity, meaning insurers are not required to pay, although the ACSA is, but it's not really enforced, it's not really regulated very well, and so a lot of payers are not really reimbursing for mental health care as they would for physical health. So I think if you are passionate about mental health, you should really talk to your state legislator, your senators, your Congress people to join organizations like NAMI, National Association of Mental Illness, and grassroots movement, and go there and for their lobbying day, or just even getting to know your representative on a personal basis, so that you can tell your story and have influence them to really regulate that more, so that there could be more equity for mental health disorders.
So we're asking parents or family members of someone who has a member of their family who has a mental health disorder, which in itself is very challenging, to take on another challenge, which we wouldn't have to do if you had cancer or diabetes, but it's a fact of life. And that unless there becomes this movement, the status quo will stay. And telemedicine or telehealth, while not completely penetrating the mental health sphere, is certainly something that most people are looking at seriously. We're trying to think, can you really engage someone completely in telehealth? Do you need to see them 1 or 2 times in person so you can develop the relationship with them so that you can continue it? But that's clearly going to be one of the answers for places like Aspen, where we just don't have enough, we certainly don't have enough child psychiatrists, but we don't have enough mental health professionals. Do you have?
Hi there.
Okay.
I think I'm the lucky one with the microphone.
Okay.
Given the broad array of people who are attending the conference, many of whom have opportunities to influence the course of the U.S. health system, can you talk more about some of the structural changes that you would like to see in the way we address mental health, ranging from, way providers are trained to pay, the parity comment was just made, for policymakers, others that you would want them to pay attention to?
Well, this is a dream come true. So if someone was really listening who had power, I would tell you that I think pediatricians are the first line of attack, and we underpay them. And if you look at this economically, they get paid for around 7 minutes of face-to-face time with their patient. So they're not motivated to ask how you're feeling and whether or not you have lots of worries, because they have to keep moving. Do you mean they're looking in your ears, they're touching your belly, they're listening to your heart, and they're seeing you once a year. So they don't necessarily know you super well. And I certainly think that we should put a social worker or a psychologist in every pediatric practice in the United States. But the social worker or the psychologist has to know at least one evidence-based treatment. They have to be an expert in cognitive behavioral therapy or parent management training. So if Steven is the pediatrician 3 miles away from me and he has a social worker who really understands parent management training, and someone in my office comes in and the kid has very bad ADD and the parents are lost, I can refer them over to Steven. We all take the same insurance. So we're not going to, because most mental health professionals in private practice are not taking health insurance. So that means the pediatrician's office has to try to find you someone. That eliminates that. And if in my office we have someone who does cognitive behavioral therapy for anxiety disorders, Steven or the other pediatrician 5 miles away can refer. Now, it's not the solution, but it'll certainly make a big difference, because one of the biggest reasons pediatricians don't want to take care of it is they don't know the answer. So if I find out the patient has depression or has ADHD, now what? And you've just going to cause me another 45 minutes of frustration, because I'm going to make phone calls or have someone make phone calls, and we're not going to find a doctor or a clinician to take care of it. And I think that has to be uniformly, and I think a pediatrician who's willing to do that, insurance companies have to pay them 20% more or 10% more for every patient they see, not only the ones who have a mental health disorder. The second thing is we have to change pediatric training programs. They don't get trained in behavioral health. They certainly learn about cancer and hematology and pulmonology, but if the number one disorder that they're seeing is mental health disorders, they need 6 months out of the 3 years of residency where they're learning learning about mental health. They should be good at diagnosis and at least how to use the medicine for 4 of the disorders or 3 of the disorders. So at least we have a first line of attack, because if you only have 8,500 child psychiatrists, the math doesn't work with 17 million kids.
Okay, I think we can take one more question over here quickly
song.
before our last song.
Right.
Yes.
So much more fun.
Well, good, 'cause I'm transitioning back to art and culture.
Good.
So, a question for Steven. I understand the incredible importance of destigmatizing mental illness and talking about mental health, but I'm interested in some of the things you said about how we are all flawed individuals and we're all struggling. And I think often, to me, life is a spectrum disorder. Everybody deals with issues of happiness and unhappiness. And my question is, it seems to me that the mass media and pop culture does a huge disservice to all of us, but particularly young people. You talked about FOMO, which if we have young people, as I have young adults, it's a very real thing. And we talk a lot in my family about anticipatointment, So what is the role of art and culture in showing a fuller range of what human experience is like? Because we seem to be focusing on, this idea of happiness and, a celebrity and happiness or tragedies. And I think for most individuals, life is always on a spectrum. How do we normalize what is not necessarily mental illness, but in fact is the hard parts of dealing with life, disappointments? How do we normalize that? How do we fight culturally and with art this idea of everybody's having a better time than you are?
That's a great question, and we do live in a world where the noisiest things are the things that that get eyeballs and get attention, and so I think it's a struggle. And I think, the thing I think immediately is so many of those pieces of art that were about normal people, or not normal people, but everyday people in life and the struggles that we go through. I remember those being in the movies that I saw like in the 90s growing up that studios don't make anymore. I think plays still talk about things like that. But it is interesting that in the broader culture, I do feel like those kinds of small human stories are harder to find. And I guess it's incumbent on all of us to try to find how to pierce that. Because I do think most of life is lived somewhere in between. I think that's one of the things that we were hoping for the end of the show, is that Evan is not cured. Evan is not a totally different person. He's just like, okay. You know what I mean? And he's survived, and he's going to keep surviving. And it's not meant to be a hurrah moment. It's really just, one foot in front of the other. And I think that's the best we can hope for sometimes.
And I also think Connor's sister.
Yeah, right.
She's had a rough time. She doesn't have a mental health disorder. And Connor's parents seem to have survived.
They're going to
also.
be okay.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, on that note, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Steven and Harold. And before we go, we have one more song from Josh Strobl. He's going to be singing For Forever, which is Evan imagining his perfect day. Thank you very much. Need to get unhooked.
Next song. End of May or early June, this picture-perfect afternoon we shared. Drive the winding country road, grab a scoop at a la mode, and then we're there. An open field that's framed with trees, we pick a spot and shoot the breeze like buddies do. Quoting songs by our favorite bands, telling jokes no one understands except us two. and we talk and take in the view. All we see is sky for forever. We let the world pass by for forever. Feels like we could go on for forever this way. Two friends on a perfect day. We walk a while and talk about the things we'll do when we get out of school. Bike the Appalachian Trail, or write a book, or learn to sail. Wouldn't that be cool? There's nothing that we can't discuss, like girls we wish would notice us, but never do. He looks around and says to me, there's nowhere else I'd rather be, and I say, me too. And we talk and take in the view. We just talk and take in the view. All we see is sky for forever. We let the world pass by for forever. Feels like we could go on for forever this way, this way. All we see is light for forever, 'cause the sun shines bright for forever. Like we'll be alright for forever this way. Two friends on a perfect day. And there he goes, racing toward the tallest tree. From far across the yellow field, I hear him calling, follow me. There we go, wondering how the world might look from up so high. One foot after the other, one branch then to another. I climb higher and higher. I climb till the entire sun shines on my face. And I suddenly feel the branch give way. I'm on the ground, my arm goes numb. I look around and I see him come to get me. He's come to get me. And everything's okay. All we see is sky for forever. We let the world pass by for forever. Buddy, you and I for forever this way, this way. All we see is light, 'cause the sun burns bright. We could be alright for forever this way. Two friends, true friends, on a perfect day.